In this video, I'm going to talk about some recent work on learning a joint model of captions and feature vectors that describe images. In the previous lecture, I talked about how we might extract semantically meaningful features from images, but we were doing that with no help from the captions. Obviously, the words in a caption ought to be helpful in extracting appropriate semantic categories from images. And similarly, the images ought to be helpful in disambiguating what the words in the caption mean. So the idea is we're going to train a great big net that gets as input standard computer vision feature vectors extracted from images and bag of words representations of captions, and learns how the two input representations are related to each other. At the end of the video, I'll show you a movie of the final network using words to create feature vectors for images, and then showing you the closest image in its database, and also using images to create bags of words. I'm now going to describe some work by Nitish Srivastava, who's one of the TAs for this course, and Ruslan Salakutinov, that will appear shortly. The goal is to build a joint density model of captions and of images, except that the images are represented by the features standardly used in computer vision, rather than by the raw pixels. This needs a lot more computation than building a joint density model of labels and digit images, which is what we saw earlier in the course. So what they did was they first trained a multi-layer model of images alone. That is, it's really a multi-layer model of the features they extracted from images using the standard computer vision features. Then separately, they train a multi-layer model of the word count vectors from the captions. Once they've trained both of those models, they add a new top layer that's connected to the top layers of both of the individual models. After that, they use further joint training of the whole system so that each modality can improve the earlier layers of the other modality. Instead of using a deep belief net, which is what you might expect, they used a deep Boltzmann machine, where there's symmetric connections between all pairs of layers. The further joint training of the whole deep Boltzmann machine is then what allows each modality to change the feature detectors in the early layers of the other modality. That's the reason they used a deep Boltzmann machine. They could have also used a deep belief net and done generative fine-tuning with contrastive wake sleep, but the fine-tuning algorithm for deep Boltzmann machines may well work better. This leaves the question of how they pre-trained the hidden layers of a deep Boltzmann machine. Because what we've seen so far in the course is that if you train a stack of restricted Boltzmann machines and you combine them together into a single composite model, what you get is a deep belief net, not a deep Boltzmann machine. So I'm now going to explain how, despite what I said earlier in the course, you can actually pre-train a stack of restricted Boltzmann machines in such a way that you can then combine them to make a deep Boltzmann machine. The trick is that the top and the bottom restricted Boltzmann machines in the stack have to be trained with weights that are twice as big in one direction as the other. So the bottom Boltzmann machine that looks at the visible units is trained with the bottom up weights being twice as big as the top down weights. Apart from that, the weights are symmetrical, so this is what I call scale symmetrical. But the bottom up weights are always twice as big as their top down counterparts. This can be justified, and I'll show you the justification in a little while. The next restricted Boltzmann machine in the stack is trained with symmetrical weights. I've called them 2W here rather than W, for reasons you'll see later. We can keep training with restricted Boltzmann machines like that, with genuinely symmetrical weights, but then the top one in the stack has to be trained with the bottom up weights being half of the top down weights. So again, these are scale symmetric weights, but now the top down weights are twice as big as the bottom up weights. That's the opposite of what we had when we trained the first restricted Boltzmann machine in the stack. After having trained these three restricted Boltzmann machines, we can then combine them to make a composite model, and the composite model looks like this. For the restricted Boltzmann machine in the middle, we simply halved its weights. That's why they were 2W2 to begin with.
For the one at the bottom, we've halved the upgoing weights, but kept the downgoing weights the same. And for the one at the top, we've halved the downgoing weights and kept the upgoing weights the same. Now the question is, why do we do this funny business of halving the weights? The explanation is quite complicated, but I'll give you a rough idea of what's going on. If you look at the layer H1, we have two different ways of inferring the states of the units in H1 in the stack of restricted Boltzmann machines on the left. We can either infer the states of H1 bottom up from V, or we can infer the states of H1 top down from H2. When we combine these Boltzmann machines together, what we're going to do is we're going to take an average of those two ways of inferring H1. And to take a geometric average, what we need to do is halve the weights. So we're going to use half of what the bottom-up model says, so that's half of 2W1, and we're going to use half of what the top-down model says, that's half of 2W2. And if you look at the deep Boltzmann machine on the right, that's exactly what's being used to infer the state of H1. In other words, if you're given the states in H2 and you're given the states in V, those are the weights you'll use for inferring the state of H1. The reason we need to halve the weights is so that we don't double count. You see, in the Boltzmann machine on the right, the state of H2 already depends on V. At least it does after we've done some settling down in the Boltzmann machine. So if we were to use the bottom-up input coming from the first restricted Boltzmann machine in the stack, and we used the top-down input coming from the second Boltzmann machine in the stack, we'd be counting the evidence twice, because we'd be inferring H1 from V, and we'd also be inferring it from H2, which itself depends on V. In order not to double count the evidence, we have to halve the weights. That's a very high level, and perhaps not totally clear description of why we have to halve the weights. If you want to know the mathematical details, you can go and read the paper. But that's what's going on. And that's why we need to halve the weights, so that the intermediate layers can be doing geometric averaging of the two different models of that layer from the two different restricted Boltzmann machines in the original stack.
In this video, I'm going to describe how we might be able to combine recognition of objects by using the relationships between their parts and recognition of objects using a deep neural network. At present in computer vision, there's broadly three approaches to recognizing objects. Either you use a deep convolutional neural net, and this currently works best, or you use a parts-based approach, which I think in the long run is going to work best, or you use the existing features that computer vision people know how to extract from images and make histograms of them, and then use lots of hand engineering. This is the approach that the convolutional neural networks have recently beaten. The point of this video is to show how we might combine a parts-based approach with early stages that use convolutional neural networks.
Even though convolutional neural networks have worked very well for recognizing objects and images, I think there's something missing. When we pool the activities of a bunch of replicated feature detectors, we lose the precise position of the feature detector that was most active. This means we don't know exactly where things are, and that's fatal for high-level parts, such as a nose and a mouth. In order to recognize whose face it is, you need to use the precise spatial relationships between high-level parts like noses and mouths. If you overlap the pools, so that each feature occurs in several different pools, you retain more information about its position, and that makes things work a bit better, but I don't think that's the answer. A related problem is that convolutional neural nets that use translations to replicate feature detectors cannot extrapolate their understanding of geometrical relationships to radically new viewpoints, like different orientations or different scales. We could, of course, try replicating across orientation and scale, but then we get huge numbers of replicated feature detectors. Now, people are very good at extrapolating. After seeing a new shape once, they can recognize it from a very different viewpoint. Currently, the way we deal with that with convolutional neural networks is to train them on transformed data. So this involves giving them huge training sets where we try to transform the data through different orientations and scales and lightings and all sorts of other things so that the network can cope with those variations. But that's a very clumsy way of dealing with the variations. I think a much better way is to use a hierarchy of coordinate frames and to use a group of neurons to represent the conjunction of the shape of a feature and its pose relative to the retina. So when these neurons are active, it tells you a feature of that kind is there, like a nose. And the precise activities or relative activities of these neurons tell you the pose of the nose. If you think about representing the pose of something, that's really a relationship between two coordinate frames. So it's a relationship between a coordinate frame embedded in the thing and the coordinate frame of the camera or retina. So in order to represent the pose of something, we have to embed a coordinate frame within it. Once we've done this, and we have a representation of the pose of parts of objects relative to the retina, it's easy to use the relationships between parts to recognize larger objects. So we're going to use the consistency of the poses of the parts as a cue for recognizing a larger shape. If you look at this picture, we have a nose and we have a mouth, and they're in the right spatial relationship to one another. One way of thinking about that is that if you ask the mouth to predict the pose of the whole face, and if you ask the nose to predict the pose of the whole face, they'll make similar predictions. If you look on the right here, we have the same nose and the same mouth, but now they're in the wrong spatial relationship. And that means that if they separately make predictions about the pose of the whole face, those predictions won't agree at all. So here's two layers in a hierarchy of parts, where the larger parts can be recognized by consistent predictions from smaller parts. Let's suppose we're looking for a face, and so in the middle here, the ellipse with TJ in it is a collection of neurons that are going to be used for recognizing the pose of the face. And the PJ next to it is a single logistic neuron that's going to be used for representing whether or not we think there's a face there. We have a similar representation in the layer below, where we have a representation of the pose for a mouth and a representation of the pose for a nose. And we're going to recognize a face by noticing that those two representations make consistent predictions. So we take a vector of activities that represents the pose of the mouth, we multiply it by a matrix Tij that represents the spatial relationship between a mouth and a face, and we get a prediction Ti times Tij for the pose of the face. We do the same thing with the nose. We take a vector of neural activities that represents the pose of the nose, Th. We multiply it by the relationship between the nose and the face, and we get another prediction for the pose of the face. If those two predictions agree, there's a face there, because the nose and the mouth are in the right spatial relationship. And that's very unlikely without there being a face there. What we're doing here is inverse computer graphics. In computer graphics, if you knew the pose of the face, you could now compute, by using the inverse of Tij, the pose of the mouth, and similarly for the nose. So in computer graphics, you're going from poses of larger things to poses of their parts. In computer vision, you need to go from the poses of the parts to the poses of larger things, and you need to check consistency when you do that. Now, if we can get a neural net to represent these pose vectors as vectors of neural activity, then we get a very nice property. Spatial relationships can then be modelled as linear operations. That makes it very easy to learn a hierarchy of visual entities, and it also makes it very easy to generalize across viewpoints. So what's going to happen when we make small changes in viewpoint is the pose vectors, those vectors of neural activities, are all going to change. What's going to be invariant is the weights. It was the weights that represented the relationship between a part and a whole, like Tij on the previous slide, and those don't depend on viewpoint. So we want to get the invariant properties of a shape into the weights, and we want to have the pose vectors in the activities, because when we change viewpoint, all those pose vectors are going to change. So rather than trying to get neural activities that are invariant to viewpoint, which is what the pooling in a convolutional net is trying to do, we're going to aim to get neural activities that are equivariant to viewpoint. As the pose of the object varies, the activities of the neurons vary. That means the percept of an object, not its label, but what it looks like, is going to change as the viewpoint changes. I'm going to finish by giving you some evidence that our visual systems really do impose coordinate frames in order to represent shapes. This was pointed out a long time ago by a great psychologist called Irvin Rock. So if you look at this shape and I tell you it's a country, most people don't know which country it is. They look at it and they think it looks a bit like Australia, but it's a sort of mirror image of Australia, but it's not really a familiar country at all. If you tell them where the top is, that it's that way up, they immediately recognize that it's Africa. If they know what coordinate frame to impose on it, it immediately becomes a familiar shape. Similarly, if I give you a shape like this one, you can perceive it as a square or you can perceive it as a diamond. Those are two completely different percepts. What you know about the shape is totally different depending on which way you perceive it. So for example, if you perceive it as a tilted square, you're acutely sensitive to whether the angles are right angles. If you perceive it as an upright diamond, you're not sensitive to that at all. The angles could be 5 degrees off and you wouldn't notice it. But you are sensitive to something else. If you perceive it as an upright diamond, you're acutely sensitive to whether the corner on the left and the corner on the right are at the same height. And you'll probably notice now that in this figure, they're very slightly different heights. These kinds of demonstrations are evidence that in order to represent shapes, we impose coordinate frames on them. Because when you're looking at that square or diamond, it's the same thing you're looking at, but the percept's totally different depending on what coordinate frame you impose.
In this video, I'm going to talk about some exciting recent work, which I think will go a long way towards answering the question, how do you set all those hyperparameters in a neural network? This recent work uses a different kind of machine learning to help us decide what values to use for the hyperparameters. In other words, it's using machine learning to replace the graduate student who fiddles around with all these different settings of the hyperparameters to find out what works. It relies on a way of modelling smooth functions called Gaussian processes, which I had always thought of as inadequate for doing things like speech and vision, and I still think they're inadequate for that. But when you're in a domain where you don't have much prior knowledge, and the only thing you can really appeal to is that you expect similar inputs to have similar outputs, then Gaussian processes are ideal. And that's the domain we're in when we're fiddling around with vectors of hyperparameters, hoping to find a vector of hyperparameters that works well. So for example, the number of hidden units, the number of layers, the weight penalty, whether to use dropout or not, those are all hyperparameters. and different combinations of them work well together. So this is a very hard space to explore by hand. It's very easy, when we're exploring it by hand, to fail to notice things. Gaussian processes are very good at noticing trends in the data, and they provide a very good way of finding good sets of hyperparameters if you have enough computers. One of the commonest reasons that people give for not using neural networks is that it requires a lot of skill to set the hyperparameters. This is actually a pretty good reason. If you don't have much experience, it's easy to get stuck using a completely wrong value for one of the hyperparameters, and then nothing works. You have to set things like the number of layers, the number of units per layer, what types of units to use, the weight penalty, the learning rate, the momentum, and so on and so on. If you use a learning rate that's 100 times too big or 100 times too small, your network simply won't work. One way to approach this is to do a naive grid search. That is, for each of these hyperparameters, you make a list of alternative values, and then you try all possible combinations of values. You can see that this is going to blow up if you have more than a few hyperparameters. You're going to end up with many more combinations than you can possibly try. It turns out that there's something that's considerably better than doing a naive grid search. We can just sample random combinations. That is, for each hyperparameter, we make a list of alternatives, and then we pick one thing randomly from each list. The reason that's better is because some of the hyperparameters won't have much effect, and others will have a lot of effect. And what we don't want to do is exactly repeat the settings of the hyperparameters that have a lot of effect for different settings of hyperparameters that don't have much effect. We don't learn much that way. In a grid search, you'll have several points along each axis that are identical for all the other parameters. And so if moving along that axis of the grid search makes no difference, you've replicated the same experiment many times and haven't learnt anything about the other parameters. There's something we can do that's much better than random combinations. And basically it amounts to saying, let's use machine learning to simulate the graduate student who is trying to decide what the hyperparameters should be. So instead of using random combinations, we look at the results we've got so far and try and predict what combinations are likely to work well. That is, we have to predict regions of the hyperparameter space in which we expect to get good results. It's not sufficient just to say how well we expect to do. We also have to have an idea of the uncertainty. We might, for example, have a region where we expect to do about the same as we're currently doing, but maybe we would do much better. In that case, it would be worth going and exploring that region. It's even worth exploring regions where we expect to do worse, but we might just do a lot better. Now we're going to assume that the amount of computation involved in evaluating one setting of the hyperparameters is huge. It involves training a big neural network on a huge data set, and it might take several days on a big computer. Relative to that amount of work, building a model to predict how well a setting of the hyperparameters will do, given all the settings we've experimented with so far, is much less work. And so it's going to require much less computation to fit the predictive model to the results of the experiments we've seen so far than it is to run a single experiment. So what kind of model are we going to use for predicting the results of future experiments? It turns out there's a kind of model I haven't talked about in the course called Gaussian process models. Basically all these models do is assume that similar inputs give similar outputs. They don't have any more sophisticated prior than that. But they're very good at using that prior in an effective way. So if you don't know much about what you expect hyperparameters to do, a weak prior like that is probably the best you can do. Gaussian processes are able to learn, for each input dimension, what the appropriate scale is for measuring similarity. So for example, if the number of hidden units could be 200 or it could be 300, the question is, are those similar numbers or are those very different numbers? Should we expect the results we get with 200 to be very similar to the results we get with 300, or should we expect them to be very different? If we don't know anything about neural nets, initially we have no idea. but we could look at the results of experiments so far. And if experiments with 200 and experiments with 300 tend to give very similar answers when you take into account the other differences between the experiments, then 200 is probably similar to 300. And so we set a scale for that dimension such that you need differences of much more than that to expect to get very different results. Now, it's important that Gaussian process models do more than just predicting the expected outcome of a particular experiment. That is, how well the neural net that we train will do on a validation set. In addition to predicting a mean value for how well they expect the neural network to do, they predict a distribution, they predict a variance. They're called Gaussian processes because their predictions are Gaussian. When they're making a prediction for new settings of the hyperparameters that are close to several consistent settings that we've already run, so we know the answer, their predictions will tend to be fairly sharp. That is, they'll have low variance. But when they're making predictions for experiments where the hyperparameters are very different from any setting of the hyperparameters we've experimented with so far, the predictions made by Gaussian process models will have very high variance. So here's quite a good strategy for using Gaussian processes to decide what to try next. So remember, we have one kind of learning model, which is a big neural network that takes a long time to run, and we're trying to figure out a good setting of the hyperparameters to try next. We have a different kind of machine learning algorithm, called a Gaussian process, that's looking at the results of the experiments we've done so far and trying to predict for some proposed new setting of the hyperparameters how well the neural network would do, and also how uncertain that prediction is. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep track of the hyperparameters that have worked best so far. That is a single setting of all the hyperparameters that gave us the neural net with the highest performance so far. Now, when we run the next experiment, our best setting so far might be replaced by the new experiment because it gives better performance of the neural net, or it might stay the same. So since we're going to substitute the results of the new experiment if it's better than anything we've seen so far, our best setting so far can only improve. So here's a good strategy for what setting of the hyperparameters to try next. We pick a setting of the hyperparameters such that the expected improvement in our best setting is big. We don't worry about the fact that we might do an experiment that leads to a really bad result, because if it gets a really bad result, we won't replace our best so far with this new experiment. Also, we'll learn something. This is a phenomenon that managers of hedge funds know about. They often tell the client, if the fund goes up, I'll take 3% of your profits. If the fund goes down, you lose. Now that's a crazy thing for a client to agree to, because that gives the hedge fund manager a huge incentive for taking huge risks, because he has no significant downside. But for finding hyperparameters that work well, it's a sensible strategy. So consider these three predictions, A, B, and C. We're going to suppose that A, B, and C are different settings of the hyperparameters that have not yet been tried, and those green Gaussians are the predictions of our Gaussian process model for how well each of those settings would do. For setting A, the mean is well below our current best so far, and there's only moderate variance. For setting B, the mean is closer to our best so far, but since there isn't much variance, there really isn't that much upside. For setting C, the mean is actually lower than for setting B, but because there's high variance, there's a big upside. We're going to take the area under Gaussian C that's above the red line, and we're going to take the moment of that area about the red line, and that's the thing we're looking for the maximum of. And you can see that C has a much bigger moment than B or A. It may only have the same area as B above the line, but some of that area is much further above the line, so we might get a very big win if we try setting C. So that's the one, our policy, would tell us to pick here. A is the worst bet, B is intermediate, and C is the best bet. So how well does this work? Well, if you got the resources to run a lot of experiments, it's much better than a person at finding good combinations of the hyperparameters. The policy I gave you so far is a strictly sequential policy that assumes that it can see all of the experiments run so far. But there's no reason why you shouldn't make it a bit more complicated and run a whole bunch of experiments in parallel. Using a Gaussian process model to predict how well a particular setting of the hyperparameters will do is sensible because it's not the kind of task we're good at. It's not like vision or speech, and it's not clear that there's a lot of complicated structure to be found in the data. It may be that the only real structure is that things are smooth and they have some scale. Also, a person can't keep in mind the results of 50 different experiments to see what they predict. If you're doing all this by hand, you might just fail to notice that all of your good results had very small learning rates and all of your really bad results had very big learning rates, because you're attending to lots of other things that you're varying. A Gaussian process model would not miss a trend like that. One final reason why Gaussian process models are a very good way of setting the hyperparameters is they're much less likely than a person to cheat. Typically when we're doing research, we want to compare a new method that we thought of with some old or standard method. And there's a very strong tendency to work harder to find good hyperparameters for our new method than for the stupid old method. That's why when you compare methods, you should really compare the results got by different groups, where for each method, the results are produced by the group that believes in that method. If we use Gaussian process models to search for good sets of hyperparameters, they're going to do just as hard a search for the type of model we don't believe in as they are for the type of model we do believe in.
In this final video, I was tempted to make some predictions about the future of research on neural networks. Instead, I'm going to explain to you why it would be extremely foolish to try and make any long-term predictions.
I'm going to try and explain why we can't predict the long-term future by using an analogy. Imagine you're driving a car at night and you're looking at the tail lights of the car in front. The number of photons that you receive from the tail lights of the car in front falls off as 1 over d squared, where d is the distance to the car in front. That's assuming that the air is clear. But now suppose there's fog. Over short ranges, the number of photons you get from the tail lights in front of you still falls off as 1 over d squared, because over a short range, the fog hardly absorbs any light. But for large distances, it falls off as e to the minus d, and that's because fog has an exponential effect. Fog absorbs a certain fraction of the photons per unit distance. So for small distances, fog looks very transparent, but for large distances it looks very opaque. So the car in front of us becomes completely invisible at a distance at which our short-range model, the 1 over d squared model, predicts it will be very visible. That causes people to drive into the back of cars in fog. It kills people. The development of technology is also typically exponential. So over the short term, things appear to change fairly slowly, and it's easy to predict progress. All of us, for example, can probably make quite good guesses about what will be in the iPhone 6. But in the longer run, our perception of the future hits a wall, just like with fog. So the long-term future of machine learning and neural nets is really a total mystery. We've no idea what's going to happen in 30 years' time. There's just no way to predict it from what we know now, because we're going to get exponential progress. In the short run, however, in a period of, say, 3 to 10 years, we can predict it fairly well, and it seems obvious to me that over the next 5 years or so, big deep neural networks are going to do amazing things. I'd like to congratulate all of you who stuck it out long enough to get this far. I hope you've enjoyed the course, and good luck with the final test.